January 1945, along the Western Front, American and British forces pushed back the remnants of Wehrmacht troops that had pushed deep into Belgium in what had become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the east, the Red Army is rolling towards the borders of the Third Reich. Millions of men are poised for the final battle. For Germany, it is Armageddon, and Hitler is prepared to see his people perish in its flames. It had been a long war. The new year had arrived with the hope that it soon would all be over. But bombs were still dropping on London. At first, flying bombs, the V-1s. Later, V-2 rockets, which could be fired from hundreds of miles away to drop their deadly explosives unseen and unheard until they struck. The war had started 5 years previously, and few could forget how they felt that dreadful day in September 1939, and what had happened since.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Now, in the winter of 1944, the war finally had been brought home to the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge was the last opportunity Hitler had to stop the British and the American advance. He could no longer muster the forces to initiate battles. The Germans could only react to the Allied thrusts. But Hitler still had resources. His greatest allies were the natural barriers of the Ruhr and Rhine rivers, and before them his heavily fortified West Wall. While tanks and sappers could blow holes through the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, the Rhine flowed from Switzerland to the North Sea, and crossing it would require as much manpower, logistical support, and blood as had been expended in Operation Overlord and the Normandy landings. Eisenhower was still Supreme Allied Commander, but there was dissension in the ranks, above and below. Field Marshal Montgomery sought to concentrate Allied troops under his command for a push across the Northern Rhine, where his forces were concentrated. From there, he would maneuver onto the relatively open North German plain, good tank country. From there, he could capture the German ports of Bremen and Hamburg ahead of the Russians. Prime Minister Churchill, looking beyond the end of the war, did not want the Soviets left in control of Germany. But they were advancing towards Berlin faster than either the British or Americans. General Eisenhower favored attacking across the broad front. Berlin was not an absolute goal. Killing large numbers of German soldiers was. In early February, Eisenhower made his decision. Montgomery would be allowed to proceed in the north, while the Americans would continue the assault along the length of the Rhine. The grand strategy would include the armies crossing the river at various points, and then moving into the industrial heart of Germany in the Ruhr and Saar regions. Eisenhower had nearly 4 million troops at his disposal, while Hitler had just 1 million on the Western Front. While this figure included many hardened veterans, many were mere boys and old men who now made up the Volksgrenadier, the People's Infantry. However, a round fired by a 12-year-old boy could be just as lethal. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would have the honor of leading off this last offensive of the war. The biggest hurdle would be wading through the flooded waters of the Ruhr River basin. On 8 February, Operation Veritable began with British and Canadian soldiers moving from Holland into northwest Germany. The American 9th Army to Montgomery's south, however, was bogged down in the murky waters of the Ruhr. The Germans had opened sluiceways of the Schwammenau Dam, and 111 million feet of water poured into the path of the encroaching Americans. It would take days before the floodwaters receded. This left the British in a narrow gap to face determined German defenders of the fatherland. The days dragged on. Finally, the waters began to recede. On February 23rd, the delayed U.S. offensive began. The crucial element was the combat engineer teams. Their assault boats, pontoon bridges, and brute strength were used to get across the river. By nightfall, some 25,000 Americans had crossed. The link-up between the Commonwealth and the U.S. forces finally took place. The way was open for the rush to the Rhine. The air war grew even more intense, as virtually every German city and town was subject to round-the-clock bombing. The American strategic strike aircraft and the RAF's Bomber Command dropped more than 2,500 tons daily of high explosives. On the evening of February 13, 773 Lancaster bombers took off. Destination, Dresden. Tens of thousands died in a single night. In early February, the big three Allied leaders, Prime Minister Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Marshal Joseph Stalin, had already agreed on how a conquered Germany would be divided. It was clear the Soviets would insist on maintaining strong interests in the lands they were at that very moment capturing in their drive westward. But they were not unaided. The Americans and British had poured vast amounts of material into the Soviet war effort, along difficult and dangerous supply routes. The northern seaward passage to Russia was particularly brutal, as Allied convoys faced attacks from German submarines and long-range aircraft. Overland, supplies had initially come over the Alaska Highway, cut through the Canadian Northwest wilderness. Later, rail and road links through Persia were finally established. So fueled, the Soviet juggernaut plowed on towards Prussia. By now, the great cities of Germany lay in the path of the Allied infantry. Over the next weeks, the Germans fought a determined rear guard action as they retreated across the Rhine, destroying bridges as they went. Still, unless the Allies could seize one of the river's spans still standing, the advance into the interior of Germany would be halted too. Up and down the line, the Americans raced to find a structure intact. Field Marshal Montgomery was wary of the haste of the Americans. His strategy called for a coordinated, well-thought-out offensive, not simple expediency. This potential for Allied disunity became clear when the American First Army reached Cologne. The Americans had moved through relatively light German defense to the city's outskirts. After a brief but intense fight at the city's airport, Cologne lay before them. As troops moved into the city's center, snipers and last-ditch defenders fought on. An American Army camera team recorded the final fight for Cologne and its ancient cathedral. On the home front, the message would be clear. The fight for Germany itself would remain savage to the very end. This was the first large metropolitan area captured by the Americans. Its devastation was total. More than 100 million pounds of explosives had been dropped on the city. Little was left standing except the twin towers of the famous cathedral. But the biggest prize eluded the Americans. The Rhine bridges at the city had been destroyed. There was still no way to cross. Finally, luck, the soldier's best friend, came to the aid of the Allies. On 7 March, some 30 miles south of Cologne, at the town of Remagen, there was the 1,000-foot Ludendorff railway bridge, and a patrol of the Americans reached it as German soldiers were still retreating across its planked-over rails. Quickly, word was passed to the rear, and tanks and more men were brought up. They raced up to the bridge, only to face a huge explosion as they approached its western end. The bridge had been rigged for demolition, but the German engineers had only destroyed part of its approaches. The span itself was intact. This was a prize worth any sacrifice. The Americans pressed on. The horrified German engineers hesitated. They sought permission to destroy the rest of the bridge. Precious minutes were lost while the Americans bore down on them. Finally, their paperwork in order, the Germans moved to set off the other explosives planted on the structure. Nothing happened. The detonating lines had been severed. Finally, a German soldier volunteered to set the fuses by hand. Under withering fire, he succeeds, and a huge explosion rocks the bridge. But the charge was too small. Though severely damaged, the bridge still stood, at least enough of it for the infantry to get across. The Americans moved onto the bridge and crossed over to the other side. The Rhine had finally been traversed. News was flashed to Eisenhower, who ordered every available man to converge on Remagen and get across the bridge before it gave way. 5 divisions were dispatched to that one shattered crossing. However, the Germans were not going to allow the Americans to pass easily into the heart of the Third Reich. They poured incessant fire towards the bridgehead. Especially dangerous was the long-range rail-mounted artillery, but the Germans shot whatever guns they could get into range. Even frogmen were pressed into duty to destroy the bridge. A group of 20 were let into the Rhine upstream from the span, but heavy American fire forced them out of the water. They never got close. Still, the damage done by the initial explosions had sealed the fate of the Ludendorff Bridge. It had been fatally damaged. Engineers took huge risks to make frantic repairs to the structure, working in the damaged girders under German fire. The Americans, nevertheless, still poured men and equipment across the structure. Still, if it collapsed before enough reinforcements got across the Rhine, the bridgehead could become a death trap. The engineers began building 2 pontoon bridges near the Ludendorff. This intensified German response. They literally threw everything they had into the battle. V-2 rockets were targeted in the bridgehead area. Their impact shocked the Americans. German jets flew sorties against the bridges, but still the Allies came. The pontoon bridges were completed, and as if to say its job was done, the bridge finally collapsed in a roar, killing 23 soldiers. Hitler and his generals had counted on the Rhine to hold up the Americans, British, and Canadians, while he dealt with the Soviets encroaching from the east. Since January, the Red Army had been advancing along a wide front. They continued to close on Berlin. In Stalin's mind, there was no debate about conquering the very seat of Nazism. Berlin remained his target. Budapest was a crucial objective for the Red Army advancing along the Danube River. The Germans meant to hold the city at all costs as a shield against the Soviets moving into Austria. The Danube divided the city in two. The Russians fought through Pest to take Buda on the opposite bank. 2 Ukrainian armies led the advance. There was much house-to-house fighting as the Germans refused to surrender. Houses were turned into strong points, and the Russians were forced to fight house by house. The Germans made a desperate attempt to supply their isolated forces by air. The Luftwaffe failed. Casualties were high on both sides. On January the 20th, Hungary sought an armistice with Moscow. By mid-February, the remaining German forces surrendered in the city. The Soviets next moved toward Czechoslovakia. The citizens of Prague did not wait for the Allies. They rose up against the Nazi occupation forces, as both US and Soviet forces were headed for the city. After 3 days of fighting, the Russians arrived, forcing the Germans out. The Soviets now moved farther up the Danube toward Austria and took Vienna. The Germans had moved many of their remaining forces to the Eastern Front. Now, with the Americans having breached the Rhine, Hitler's high command saw few options. Hitler would not allow talk of defeat, but its inevitability was clear to his generals. The Americans quickly capitalized on their good fortune. Patton's Third Army swarmed into southern Germany and the Saar, an important industrial base still operational in the Reich. The move put added pressure on the Germans, but it committed men who would otherwise have supported Montgomery's own move across the Rhine. While Patton's forces played havoc with the Germans in the south, it was still Montgomery who was in the best position to move from the west onto Berlin. While the landscape was flatter than the south, the river barriers were formidable. The lower Rhine was wide, and after the Rhine were industrial canals, the Weser and Elbe rivers. Montgomery planned his attack, codenamed Operation Plunder, very carefully. His immediate objective was the small industrial city of Wesel. On the evening of 23 March, a thunderous barrage erupted along a 22-mile front, with more than 5,000 artillery pieces and rockets shelling German positions. Under the cloak of darkness, the first assault waves plied across the Rhine. Vessels from small boats to naval landing craft were used to ferry men across. Once the east bank was secured, engineers set about to bridge the river for the heavy vehicles and many tons of equipment the army would need. The next morning, the continued assault was viewed personally by Prime Minister Churchill, who was determined to be close to the action. The Prime Minister and his entourage watched as the last great airborne assault of the war took place. Some 21,000 men of the 6th British Airborne Division and the 17th American Airborne were dropped by glider behind German lines. The lessons of the debacle of Arnhem were not lost on the tacticians. The objective was just a few miles from the ground forces already across the river, and a link-up would occur that same day. Even though the German defenders could hardly be compared to the mighty Nazi forces that had fought in Normandy, individual German soldiers could still be disciplined and deadly efficient in close combat. The airborne troops suffered high casualties. Nearly 2,000 of their number were either killed or wounded. By the end of March, the Rhine had been crossed along a 200-mile-wide front from the north to the south of Germany. Yet the Wehrmacht could not yet be considered a defeated force. The Allied armies now moved into the Ruhr, the center of Germany's once great industrial engine. The area's factories, from the great Krupp works to the humblest machinist shop, were still capable of grinding out munitions for fueling the death throes of the Nazis. Combined armor, infantry, and air attacks saw the Allies move from town to town in quick succession. The fights were brief, brutal, and always successful. Individual units of the Wehrmacht were still capable of organized resistance, but the sheer weight of the Allied advance overwhelmed the defenders. In a single day, the 35th U.S. Division moved more than 200 miles eastward into Germany. The Ruhr was enveloped, and the Americans now moved towards the Elbe, the last natural barrier before Berlin. They reached it by April 11. Meanwhile, in the north of Germany, Montgomery's forces were facing determined and well-organized German resistance. The Nazis were able to concentrate forces with the sea on one flank. Still, the British and Canadians moved forward. The critical port city of Hamburg fell. Montgomery was heading for Berlin, but capturing the capital was not Eisenhower's priority. Already, the Yalta agreements had placed Berlin in the Soviet zone. Eisenhower sent a cable to Stalin outlining what the Supreme Allied commander believed was the best tactical approach. It included the Americans and British mopping up Nazi resistance in the Ruhr and advancing into southern Germany to prevent that area from becoming a refuge for German resistance once the industrialized north was occupied. Berlin was not a major factor in the message. This outraged the British. Nevertheless, the decision of the Americans stood. Berlin would not be the most important objective on the Western Front. Killing the enemy, according to Eisenhower, not geographical goals, was the objective in war. City after city in the Third Reich now fell to the Allied forces. Still, the German forces fought on. In mid-April, the British liberated a concentration camp at a place called Belsen, and the Americans arrived at Buchenwald. To describe war as hell was accurate, but this was beyond war and beyond hell. At Belsen, 10,000 unburied bodies would be found by the British. Many of the living were merely breathing corpses. Rumors had circulated throughout the war of the concentration camps, but the truth of them defied imagination. 50 years later, even scenes of the camps seem unreal. Yet human beings could and did commit what would later be simply termed crime against humanity. Human hair was collected for mattresses, gold from dentures pulled from the teeth of prisoners. This was the reality of the Holocaust. The Jews of Germany would virtually perish as a race, but others suffered in the camps. There were the Germans who opposed the Nazis, homosexuals who were forced to wear pink, gypsies, and the sick and infirm who were considered a burden to the master race. Most were slain. The Allied commanders would only spare small forces to help at the camps. The great majority of their doctors, medics, and support troops had to press ahead with the combat units. Small task forces spread out through the German countryside to provide emergency food and medical supplies. German locals were forced to come to the camps, both to witness the scene of what they had tolerated and to bury the dead. There was little the Allied doctors could do for the many thousands who were dying. They could only slightly ease their final pains. At least they would die, knowing the Nazis had been defeated. For the millions who had died in the camps before the liberation, the Allies could only offer a decent burial. On 20 April, troops of the 7th U.S. Army took Nuremberg, this hallowed shrine of the Nazi Party. The city, like most others in Germany, had been nearly destroyed, but enough of the remnants of the past still stood, another grim reminder of what the Nazis had done to the soul of a nation. The time to end the madness was at hand, but President Roosevelt would not see victory. On April 12, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Hitler would outlive him, but not for long. In mid-April, Nazi Germany was nearly at an end as an organized state. It had armies in the field, but its heart was mortally wounded. The day after Roosevelt died, Vienna fell to the Red Army. More than 6 million Soviet soldiers were deployed across the Eastern Front. 3 million Allied troops were approaching from the west, and the Americans were just a little more than 50 miles from the city. The Germans could still count on as many as 5 million men on duty, but many were scattered in the Third Reich's still far-flung empire, from the Channel Islands to Greece and Norway. German cities lay in ruins. Industrial output was at a minimum, even with slave labor. On April 16, 11 Soviet armies were poised for the final Battle of Berlin. More than 1 million men. The British had closed on the Elbe in the north, and the Americans were pushing through southern and central Germany. On April 25, the Red Army and the Americans came together on the Elbe. The British and Soviet forces met a few days later, but this would mark the end of the Allied offensive in northern Germany. General Eisenhower had already decided to let the Russians take Berlin. It would be a bloody business. The Germans knew the Russians hated them, and for good reason. Millions of Soviets had died at the hands of the Germans, and revenge would now be theirs. Hitler and his remaining staff planned a street-by-street defense of Berlin. The Hitler Youth were called up. Makeshift Home Guard units were formed, armed with little more than one-shot grenade launchers or rifles with little ammunition. This did not stop the Red Army or even slow it. Stalin, whose regard for human life was tenuous at best, would not hesitate to send as many men as necessary to crush Berlin. By 21 April, Berlin was surrounded by the Red Army. Inside the lines were some 75,000 defenders. The Russians moved neighborhood by neighborhood into the city, then street by street. They fired nearly 2 million artillery shells. Most of Berlin's 340 square miles became a battleground. The city's defensive features were the Spree River and the Teltow and Landwehr canals. At the heart of all of this was Hitler's bunker. By 28 April, they had moved within a mile of Hitler's refuge. On 29 April, Adolf Hitler, supreme ruler of Germany and Chancellor of the Third Reich, marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. On 30 April, they commit suicide. Their bodies are burned amid the rubbish that is now Berlin. German resistance in Italy crumbles under the onslaught of Allied forces after they broke through the mountains onto the plain of the Po River. Italian partisans joined General Alexander's forces in wiping out the remaining pockets of resistance. The Allies are welcome as liberators by the Italian people. Benito Mussolini, the deposed fascist leader, is now hunted like a common criminal. He is captured by the partisans and shot. His body, along with those of his mistress and other fascists, are mutilated and hung by the ankles in the main square in Milan. The war in Italy was over. On 7 May, Admiral Freiberg and General Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters. The war in Europe officially ends at 11:01 p.m. on 8 May. War still might be raging in the Pacific, but for many, this is the moment they were waiting for, and was marked by celebrations across the continent, a great outpouring of relief. Terrible price for freedom. More than 4.5 million Germans had been killed since September 1939. The Soviets, 20 million. Britain, nearly 500,000. Around 300,000 American troops are killed. In total, the war in Europe has killed more than 33 million people. To an extent, the Allied mission up to 8 May was simple: conquer Germany and her allies. The next day, the West woke up to the end of the war, but there was not yet peace. Germany remained at the heart of Europe. Its millions of survivors could not be ignored. Even if the Allies wanted to bring their armies home immediately, little infrastructure remained. There was little food. Germany may have been defeated, but the Western Allies, except for the United States, were hardly in a position to provide much help. Britain was virtually bankrupt. The Dutch were starving. France and the rest of Northern Europe were just emerging from the trauma of occupation. Still, plans were put into action. On June 5, the Allies signed the Declaration of the Assumption of Supreme Authority in Germany. In the eyes of the law, the Allies are now legally responsible for every detail of life in the former Third Reich. Lines of demarcation were drawn. Germany would be divided into Soviet, British, French, and American zones. Berlin, deep in Soviet-controlled territory, would also be divided. Almost from the signing of the document, the Soviets and the 3 Western Allies could not agree. The Potsdam Conference near Berlin in July set the shape of post-war Europe. Stalin demanded nearly £7 billion in reparations from Germany. He also demanded the ceding of German lands in the east to Poland. Churchill and the new American president, Harry Truman, could argue against this, but the Red Army was in fact controlling the east. The Americans and British were also preoccupied with the expected invasion of Japan. Many felt that Germany deserved whatever fate befell her. After all, it was the Germans who had started the war, and the rest of Europe wanted to rebuild shattered lives. Many in Britain wanted social changes, and on July 26, Prime Minister Churchill and the Conservatives were voted out of office. The new British Labour government and President Truman left Potsdam with the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe even tighter. Before relations deteriorated completely between the Soviets and the Western Allies, there was one last joint effort undertaken: the trial of the Nazi leadership before the eyes of the world and of Germany. The Soviet Union, Britain, the United States, and France established a tribunal at Nuremberg to try the Nazis. The presiding judge, Britain's Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, set the tone for the deliberations, declaring, "This trial is unique in the history of jurisprudence and of supreme importance to millions of people all over the globe." Indeed, all eyes were focused on battered Nuremberg when the trial began on November 20, 1945. For the next 10 months, the city in which the Nazi Party held its annual rallies saw leading Nazis held accountable for their crimes against world peace, against the rules of warfare, and of killing 11 million fellow human beings. Not all the top leaders could be tried. Some, like Hitler himself, had already committed suicide. But there were 21 others who would stand in the dock. They included Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and deputy to Hitler. Each of the prosecuting nations had their own staff of lawyers. The Nazis had been very detailed in their recording of their own crimes, and 6 boxcar loads of documents were presented as evidence. The chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, was the first to present the case against the Nazis.
In the prisoner's dock, odd, broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led, almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these miserable men as captives the power by which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its homes, and impoverishing its life. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively.
3 defendants were acquitted. 7 were sent to prison. 11 others were sentenced to die. Göring cheated the hangman. He committed suicide just before his execution. Thousands of other Nazis were either imprisoned or hanged. Slowly, Germany began to live again. For the men in uniform, occupation duty was far less dangerous than combat, but it was unpleasant work. Just moving the ruins was a major undertaking. An estimated 400 million cubic meters of rubble covered the devastated area of Germany. Though much of the countryside was spared, none of the cities were left unaffected. In Cologne, 66% of the city's homes had been destroyed. In Dusseldorf, 93% were uninhabitable. 95% of Berlin's center had been destroyed. There was little food, but more than the physical deprivations, was the destruction of the soul. Since 1933, Germany had only known Hitler, and Germany had indeed come close to being the master of Europe. For civilian and veteran alike, there seemed little to live for. Initially, the Western Allies had ordered a strict non-fraternization policy, but human nature soon changed that. Before the war had even ended, some senior American officials had proposed that post-war Germany's industrial base be eliminated. Her economy would be based solely on agriculture. But Germany was simply too big and complex a society to feed itself, and the West was in no position to take care of the Germans, even if it wanted to. The Western Allies soon came to the conclusion that Germany's economy and society would have to be allowed to rebuild. That decision would not be universally popular. The British government produced a film to help convince the public that providing aid to Germany was in everyone's best interest.
There are 70 million people in Germany, and about 30 million of them are looking for someone, or are lost and lie looking without seeing, like the eyes of a dead rabbit. They are still stunned by what hit them, stunned by the war they started. But in the search for food and the urge to get home, the life force is beginning to stir again. Today, our powers of destruction are terrifying, but the will to live is still stronger. That's why we can't wash our hands of the Germans, because we can't afford to let that new life flow in any direction it wants. Our military government, that is, your husbands and sons, have to prod the Germans into putting their house in order. Why? We have an interest in Germany that is purely selfish. We cannot live next to a disease-ridden neighbor. And we must prevent not only starvation and epidemics, but also diseases of the mind, new brands of fascism from springing up. As night falls in Germany, the people must remember the curfew. Those without homes or caught on the street disappear into the air raid shelters. Then the air raid siren wails again to remind them that they lost a war of their own making. To remind them that it is up to them to regain their self-respect as a nation and to learn to live in a friendly manner with their neighbors. To remind them that much as we hate it, we shall stay in Germany until we have real guarantees that the next generation will grow up a sane and Christian people. A Germany of light and life and freedom. A Germany that respects truth and tolerance and justice.
This vision of a new Germany was not shared by the Russians, and they were determined not to allow Germany to revive as part of the West. Cooperation between the Western Allies and Soviets deteriorated almost daily. At the core of the dispute between East and West was the Soviets' lack of cooperation in signing a peace treaty, one that would unify Germany. The West saw this as crucial to reforming an economic base, without which the rest of Europe would lie stagnant. The Russians remained intransigent. In March 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to a small college town in the heartland of America's Midwest, Fulton, Missouri. The former Prime Minister received a rousing welcome. In spite of his rejection by the British people at the polls, he remained extremely popular. These people remembered his promises of blood, toil, tears, and sweat during the darkest days of the war. Americans far beyond this Missouri town were listening when he made clear what many had feared and were just beginning to admit.
From Stettin in the Baltic, To Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Churchill condemned the Russians for undermining world peace and called for an Anglo-American military alliance to halt the spread of Soviet expansionism. Stalin condemned the speech as a declaration of war. Events moved rapidly in Europe. In May, the British and Americans agreed to end German reparation payments and agreed to unify their occupation zones. The stage was set for direct confrontation with the Soviets. The new battle for control in Europe had already begun. Communist-backed guerrillas in Greece had been fighting the British-backed government. Britain could not carry the burden alone. Her economy was still too shattered to offer much help. She would have to withdraw from Greece. But President Truman, in what has become known as the Truman Doctrine, announced that the United States would come to the aid of nations threatened by outside forces, which in this case meant the communists. Backing up Truman's works, the new Secretary of State and former Army Chief, General George Marshall, announced a plan to give economic aid to Europe and prepare a joint scheme for recovery. For the Russians, it held the threat of a resurgent Germany, a development they considered intolerable. Even though the United States still held a nuclear monopoly, Stalin knew the American people and those in Western Europe would have little stomach for renewed fighting. In Europe, he decided it was time to rid Berlin of the Western powers. While the Russians were plotting, the British and American people were still getting readjusted to peacetime. To the Americans, the end of the war meant getting the boys back from Europe and the Pacific as soon as possible and trying to put the war behind them. And they came home by the millions.
And the boys are home again, all over the world.
America itself had been untouched physically by the war, except that the arsenal for democracy had now turned into an economic powerhouse. The soldiers bought new cars and got married.
The girl that I marry will have to be.
Cheap college education was guaranteed by the government, and inexpensive loans for affordable housing caused a building boom. The huge supply of weapons that had been built during the war were put in storage or simply destroyed. Bases all around the world were closed up. Main Street, USA was changing. America's immense new wealth and confidence encouraged a generation that was the envy of the world. America's greatest export became popular culture. The new invention, television, helped spread this new image of the U.S. throughout the world.
When you're laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you're crying, you bring on the rain. So stop your sighing, be happy again, keep on smiling. 'Cause when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you.
Things were very different in Britain. Our cities had been badly battered by the German bombing. Some 60,000 civilians had been killed and 86,000 badly injured. Untold billions of pounds of damage had been done. Even before the war had ended, the government had announced plans for reconstruction. Many of these hopes would not easily be realized, according to the Minister for Reconstruction.
Reconstruction of Britain will take many years. Don't let's be impatient. Don't let's try to get to a new economic heaven on a non-stop flight. First things must come first. Food, homes, and work. I will make no promises until I know that they can be fulfilled. That's the reason why you have confidence in the Ministry of Food. All I can say about the future is that I will faithfully and without prejudice examine the facts in association with my cabinet colleagues and endeavor to produce proposals worthy of our very great nation.
There were shortages of everything, but mainly money. The British working man and woman had worked hard during the war. They had made many sacrifices. This is how they had learned to cope during the war, and were now told to continue this frugal approach.
The Board of Trade has arranged with Harrods an exhibition showing the housewife how to turn old things into something quite different and good as new. For instance, the new mother may be at her wit's end how to get a cot for the little treasure. Well, if you can get hold of some old sacking, it's quite easy. Not perhaps the frilly vision you had in your mind's eye, but it doesn't cost any coupons, nor does the baby. Now, baby, good behavior, please. There's a little gadget that enables sewing machines to darn huge holes in a few minutes. Perhaps they'll soon invent something for attaching bits of new material between the darns. Well, when it comes to clothes, make-do and men needn't be at all unfashionable. Listen to what you can do.
Here is Mrs. Quilty on her way to the bathroom. She's wearing a patchwork dressing gown made of odd pieces of material. The lining was formerly a dust sheet. Her pajamas are made from pieces of material found in the attic, presumably great-grandmama's bed valance. Mrs. Clark made her frock from a pair of her husband's old +4 trousers and half a yard of new material. Here is Rita on her way to school. She's wearing a frock made from odd pieces of material. Her coat was formerly her elder sister's, remodeled for Rita's use, and the hat made from pieces of material left over. There's not much use for men's dress clothes these days. Mr. Weston found his didn't fit him when he came home on leave, so Mrs. Weston made herself this costume. The long pockets were the chief difficulty. These she overcame by inserting a narrow belt. I would like to end with a reassurance to women and a warning to men. To the ladies, you may be reassured that all garments made in make, do, and mend are entirely exclusive. To the men, lock up your favorite old clothes before you leave home in the morning.
Even humor could not substitute for the unifying influence of a determined national enemy. The country needed to increase productivity before new wealth could be generated to pay for a better lifestyle. Industrial disputes slowed down or stopped businesses. A lack of coal forced manufacturers to close production lines already hit by a lack of raw materials. The servicemen who were returning home desperately needed jobs. But even for heroes, the work that was available did not always match the skills and leadership qualities displayed in the war.
Geared up to handle 11,000 men a day, the government's demob machine gets into full swing with a broadcast statement from Mr. George Isaacs, Minister of Labour.
Industry and commerce want to get going, so you will find that you will be welcomed, not only with thankfulness for your safe return, with gratitude for your victories, but also because industry and your fellow workers are looking forward to seeing you back at the bench or in the office or on the farm, helping to bring the prosperity which should be the reward for our great endeavours during the past 6 years.
Demobs will reach 1.5 million by the end of the year and 3 million by next June. Already back in Civvy Street with a hero's ticket is ex-Flight Lieutenant Edward Nold, DFC, who has changed his uniform for a uniform.
After 6 years flying in Bomber Command with the Pathfinder Force, blowing Germany to pieces, I am now back on the job again on the 16 route. It is perfectly wizard being back again.
The reconstruction process would take years of work and billions of pounds. Yet Britain still had immense overseas responsibilities. The empire was crumbling. India gained independence. In Palestine, 10,000 British soldiers had been tied up in a brutal guerrilla war with Jewish settlers, which would soon turn into an international crisis with the creation of Israel. But the greatest challenge to the West came once again from the East. On 24 June 1948, the Soviets announced they would halt all passenger and freight traffic to and from Berlin for technical reasons. Those problems would last for more than a year. In cutting off Berlin, the Russians sought to starve the city into submission and drive the British, French, and Americans away. To break the blockage with troops would have meant war. The Allies called the Russians bluff. The air corridors remained open, and the next day, 80 tons of supplies were flown in. It would be the world's greatest airlift. The U.S. Air Force C-47s and C-54s, along with British Dakotas, York transports, and Hastings, were soon flying in thousands of tons of supplies, from coal to food. Even RAF Sunderland flying boats were pressed into service, landing on Berlin's lakes. Anything that flew and could carry freight went to Berlin in what the British termed Operation Plainfare. Eventually, the average daily cargo amount reached 8,000 tons. Planes were landing and taking off at a rate of 2 or 3 a minute in good weather. Even when conditions were foul, the planes flew. But it was dangerous work. The Americans backed up their determination to hold Berlin by deploying B-29 bombers at British bases within striking distance of Soviet targets. Army units were reinforced. Eventually, the Russians admitted defeat and lifted the blockade in September 1949. During the airlift, the Allies had flown 300,000 airlift flights. 24 planes crashed and 48 died in the operations. Few Berliners gave consideration to the fact that just 3.5 years before, British and American air crews had been pounding the city by day and night. In April 1949, the United States, Britain, Canada, France, the Benelux countries, Norway, Denmark, Italy, and Portugal signed the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO was formed. The agreement assured that a Soviet attack on any member state would be an attack on all. Peace was not truly established in Europe, but stability was. For the next 40 years, forces from the East and West would face across Churchill's now famous Iron Curtain before it eventually came down, before there was finally victory in Europe.
Thank you.